Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The video I almost ignored. What if the YouTube video you almost skipped was the one thing you needed to hear? One night in my home in the United States, I was sitting on the kitchen floor after an argument with my husband. Trying not to cry because my children were asleep upstairs. I felt exhausted, misunderstood, and strangely embarrassed by my own life. Then my phone played a YouTube video I had not even searched for. I almost swiped away. Instead, I listened to one sentence, and suddenly I realized the problem was not only my marriage, and it was not only my English. It was the way I had learned to react when life became difficult. My life looked normal from the outside. I had a husband, children, a home, work, groceries waiting to be bought, dishes waiting to be washed, and a phone that seemed determined to remind me about everything I had forgotten. But normal does not always mean peaceful. Some evenings, I felt like I had spent the entire day taking care of everyone except myself. My husband and I still loved each other, but our conversations had become strangely predictable. He would ask a simple question. I would hear criticism. I would defend myself. He would become frustrated. Then I would become even more frustrated. It was like watching the same bad movie every week and somehow paying for the ticket again. That night, however, YouTube interrupted the pattern. The video was about communication and learning through simple English. I listened slowly because the speaker was clear. I noticed the short sentences. I repeated one quietly, pause before you respond. I was not thinking about English anymore. I was thinking about myself. So the next morning, I tried something different. Instead of immediately answering my husband when I felt irritated, I paused. I took one breath. Then another. I said, "Give me a moment." It was such a small sentence, but it created space between my emotion and my reaction. I began watching one slow English video every morning. I listened, read the subtitles, and repeated a few simple phrases aloud. I did not study for hours. I simply practiced consistently. And something unexpected happened. The more slowly I spoke English, the more slowly I began to respond in real life. I started listening instead of preparing my next argument. I started noticing what my husband actually meant instead of what I feared he meant. But I still believed YouTube was only teaching me English. I had no idea that one particular video was about to reveal something much more personal, something about my marriage that I had been refusing to see. And when I finally heard that sentence, I stopped the video immediately. Because it sounded like someone had been secretly watching my life. The perfect life wasn't perfect. The most dangerous lie I told myself was not "I am unhappy." It was "everything is fine." Because everything did look fine. In my home in the United States, there were family photos on the walls, children laughing in the hallway, my husband coming home from work, and ordinary American evenings filled with dinner, homework, laundry, and endless little tasks. If someone had asked me, "How is your life?" I would have smiled and said, "Good." But one evening, after everyone went to bed, I stood in the kitchen and realized I had not felt truly heard for a very long time. I was not asking for a perfect marriage. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted my husband to notice when I was tired without making me explain everything. I wanted to speak without feeling that every sentence might become another argument. And, honestly, I wanted to stop feeling like I was failing at everything at once. Life in the United States can be wonderfully full, but full does not always mean balanced. There are work schedules, school activities, bills, appointments, traffic, shopping, family responsibilities, and the constant pressure to keep moving. Sometimes even resting feels like another appointment you forgot to schedule. I began noticing how this pressure affected the way I spoke to my husband. If he asked, "Did you remember to pay that bill?" I heard, "You forgot again." If he said, "Are you okay?" I sometimes heard, "You are being difficult." The words were simple. My interpretation was not. That was when my YouTube routine became more important. Every morning, I watched a short English video while drinking coffee. I listened to the speaker slowly, read the subtitles, and repeated useful phrases. One phrase stayed with me, "What do you mean?" It sounds almost too simple to matter, but I started using it in real conversations. Instead of assuming my husband was criticizing me, I asked, "What do you mean?" Sometimes his answer surprised me. He was not criticizing me at all. He was worried. Sometimes he was tired. Sometimes he simply wanted information. My brain had been filling empty spaces with stories, and most of those stories were negative. Once I noticed that, I could not unsee it. I started asking better questions. I started listening longer. I started realizing that communication was not only about speaking better English. It was about understanding before reacting. Then, one Friday evening, my husband came home unusually quiet. He put his keys on the table, looked at me, and said, "We need to talk." My stomach dropped. I immediately thought the worst. But this time, instead of defending myself, I remembered my new phrase. I looked at him and asked, "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. Then he said something that made me realize our marriage was in much deeper trouble than I had imagined. The YouTube lesson that exposed me. My husband did not say he wanted a divorce. Somehow, what he said felt even more frightening. "I don't know how to reach you anymore." I stood there in our kitchen, completely silent. For a moment, I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain how tired I was, how much I did for our family, how often I felt alone even when he was standing right beside me. But then I remembered the YouTube lesson I had watched that morning. It had taught one simple idea: before you defend yourself, make sure you understand what the other person is actually saying. So I asked, "What do you mean?" My husband looked surprised. He sat down and said, "I feel like every time I try to talk to you, you think I am attacking you." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Because deep inside, I knew he was right. I had become so used to protecting myself that I was treating ordinary conversations like battles. I suddenly remembered the English phrase I had practiced that week, "Help me understand." It was simple. It was not impressive vocabulary. But I said it anyway. Help me understand. My husband looked at me for a few seconds, then started talking. He told me he missed the woman who used to laugh easily. He said he knew I was working hard for our family, but he sometimes felt that I had become emotionally unavailable. I wanted to interrupt. I wanted to list all the reasons I was exhausted. Instead, I listened. This was surprisingly difficult. Listening sounds passive, but real listening requires effort. You have to resist the urge to prepare your next sentence while the other person is still speaking. I had been practicing this with English videos without realizing I was training the same skill for my marriage. When I listened to slow English, I could not rush. I had to wait for the sentence to finish. I had to notice the meaning. I had to accept that I might not understand everything immediately. Marriage was starting to feel exactly the same. I did not need to understand every emotion instantly. I needed to stay present long enough to understand the message. That night, my husband and I talked for almost an hour. We did not solve everything. We did something more important. We stopped pretending everything was fine. I admitted that I was overwhelmed. He admitted that he had been feeling helpless. We both cried a little, then laughed because crying while trying to look serious is surprisingly difficult. But the next morning, I discovered something that frightened me. While I was watching another YouTube video, the speaker said a sentence that described my behavior almost perfectly. I replayed it 3 times. Then I realized the problem was not only how I communicated with my husband. It was how I had been talking to myself for years. The night my marriage almost broke. My husband and I were standing in the kitchen when he said the one sentence I had secretly feared for months: I can't keep doing this. He did not shout. He did not slam the door. That made it worse. His voice was calm, tired, almost empty. I looked at him and suddenly felt the room become smaller. The refrigerator hummed behind me. A glass sat untouched on the counter. Upstairs, our children were asleep. Completely unaware that their parents were standing downstairs wondering whether their marriage could survive another year of the same arguments. I wanted to say, "But I love you." Instead, I asked, "Then what do you want me to do?" He looked at me and said, "I want you to hear me." Those 5 words broke something open inside me. I realized how often I had been waiting for my husband to understand my pain while barely listening to his. I had been collecting evidence for my own defense: the long workdays, the family responsibilities, the things I did that nobody noticed. Every disagreement became a competition over who was more exhausted. And somehow, both of us were losing. That night, we finally said the things we had avoided. He told me he felt pushed away. I told him I felt invisible. He said he was afraid that nothing he did would ever be enough. I admitted that I was constantly afraid of failing as a wife and mother. We were not enemies. We were 2 tired people wearing emotional armor inside the same home. That realization was painful, but strangely comforting. I remembered another English phrase from my YouTube practice: "I hear you." I had repeated it many times while learning pronunciation. Now I understood its real meaning. Saying "I hear you" is not the same as saying "I agree with you." It means, your feelings reached me. So I looked at my husband and said it slowly, I hear you. He looked down. Then he whispered, thank you. We sat there quietly for a while. No dramatic music. No perfect solution. Just two people finally stopping long enough to hear each other. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not healed. Not magically happy. Just awake. I opened YouTube and watched the same communication video again. This time, I noticed something I had missed before. The speaker said that when people feel threatened, they often protect themselves before they understand what is happening. I suddenly laughed. My brain had been acting like a security guard who treated every question as an emergency. That morning, I decided to train it differently. I would slow down my English. I would slow down my reactions. I would practice one small sentence every day. But I had no idea that this decision would soon affect my children, and reveal something about my marriage that I had never expected. I turned YouTube into my classroom. I never expected YouTube to become the place where I learned how to speak better English and, strangely, how to live better too. But after that difficult night with my husband, I stopped watching videos randomly. I created a tiny routine at my kitchen table in the United States. 10 minutes. One video. One short lesson. That was it. I would pour my coffee, put on my headphones, turn on subtitles, and listen to slow English. The speaker used clear, simple sentences. I listened once without reading. Then I watched again with subtitles. Finally, I repeated several sentences out loud. At first, I felt ridiculous. Imagine sitting alone in a kitchen saying, I need a moment, to absolutely nobody. My coffee probably thought I had lost my mind. But repetition slowly made the sentences feel natural. I was not trying to memorize hundreds of words. I wanted useful English I could actually use in real conversations. So I chose phrases about feelings, communication, family, and everyday life. I understand. Can we talk later? What do you mean? I need some time. Let me explain. These phrases were simple, but they gave me something I desperately needed, time. When I felt emotional, I did not have to react immediately. I could use one sentence, pause, breathe, and think. This connected with something I noticed in learning psychology. When a skill is practiced repeatedly in small, manageable steps, it becomes easier to retrieve automatically. I was training my English, but I was also training a new response pattern. Slowly, my mornings changed. Instead of opening my phone and immediately scrolling through stressful news, I listened to one calm English lesson. Instead of worrying about making mistakes, I allowed myself to repeat the same sentence 5 times. Sometimes 10 times. If I said it incorrectly, I tried again. No drama. No shame. Just another attempt. That attitude started appearing in other parts of my life. When my husband and I disagreed, I became less afraid of saying the wrong thing. I could stop and try again. I could say, that is not what I mean. I could ask, can you explain? And I began realizing something powerful. Confidence does not always come before action. Sometimes confidence comes because you keep taking small actions even while you are still afraid. My husband noticed my routine. One morning, he walked into the kitchen while I was repeating an English sentence and smiled. "Are you teaching yourself?" he asked. I laughed and said, "I think YouTube is teaching me." He looked at me and replied, "Maybe you should teach me too." I laughed again. I thought he was joking. But the next morning, he sat beside me with a cup of coffee. And what happened during our first lesson changed our entire routine. 3 words changed everything. The first time my husband joined my YouTube English practice, I expected 10 minutes of pronunciation and maybe a few jokes about my accent. I did not expect him to ask me a question that would make me completely silent. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a quiet Saturday morning in our home in the United States. My laptop was open. Coffee was getting cold. A slow English video was playing softly. I had written 3 phrases on a piece of paper. I hear you. I understand. Help me understand. My husband pointed at the last one and asked, "Do you really use that with me?" I smiled and said, "Sometimes." He looked at me and replied, "Then I want to learn it." I laughed because it sounded almost too serious for an English lesson. But we practiced anyway. He repeated the sentence. I corrected his pronunciation. Then he corrected mine. For the first time in a long while, we were sitting together without trying to prove who was right. We were simply learning. That small moment became one of the most important changes in our marriage. We started using those 3 phrases during real conversations. When one of us became frustrated, instead of immediately defending ourselves, we tried to slow down. I hear you. I understand. Help me understand. The words were simple, but they created space. That space mattered. Research on emotional regulation often emphasizes the importance of creating a pause between an emotional trigger and a response. I did not need a complicated psychological formula. I needed 3 ordinary words and enough discipline to actually use them. My English practice was teaching me something I had never expected. Slowing down can make communication stronger. I also noticed that my children began copying us. One afternoon, my daughter was upset because her brother had taken something without asking. She came into the kitchen ready to complain. Then she stopped and said, "Mom, help me understand why he did that." I stared at her. She stared at me. Then we both started laughing. Apparently, our little kitchen English lesson had escaped the kitchen. It was spreading through the house. Of course, we were not suddenly a perfect family. We still had arguments. Someone still forgot homework. Someone still left a cup in the living room. And somehow, the laundry continued reproducing overnight. But our reactions were changing. We were becoming better at repairing small problems before they became huge ones. I also became more confident with English because I stopped being afraid of imperfect sentences. I learned that communication does not require fancy vocabulary. Sometimes the strongest sentence is the simplest one. Then, one evening, my husband came home unusually quiet. He put his phone down, sat across from me, and said, "I need to tell you something." I felt that old fear return. But this time, I knew exactly what to say. I looked at him and whispered, "Help me understand." What he told me next made me question whether all our progress was real. My children started watching me. My husband's words that evening were not what I expected, and for a moment, I wondered if our marriage was about to fall apart again. He looked at me and said, "I'm scared we are only changing because we are afraid of losing each other." I felt my heart sink. Then he added, "But I think the children are changing too." I looked toward the hallway. Our children were quietly playing in the next room, and suddenly I wondered how much they had been watching. Children are funny that way. They can forget where they put their shoes 5 minutes ago, yet somehow notice every change in your voice. My daughter had started noticing our new morning routine. She would see me sitting at the kitchen table with my headphones, listening to slow English, reading subtitles, and repeating simple sentences. Sometimes she would sit beside me and ask what a word meant. I began explaining small phrases in simple English. "I hear you. I understand. Let me try again." I never planned to turn English practice into a family activity. It simply happened. One Saturday, my son heard me repeat a sentence and asked, "Why do you keep saying the same thing?" I laughed and told him, "Because repeating helps me remember." He looked at me seriously and said, "So mistakes are okay?" That question stopped me. I realized I had been learning something much bigger than pronunciation. I had been learning how to tolerate mistakes. In language learning, repetition makes familiar patterns easier to recognize and produce. In family life, repetition can build another kind of pattern. If you repeatedly apologize, listen, and try again, those behaviors can become easier too. So I started making our home a little less afraid of mistakes. If I said something wrong in English, I corrected myself without embarrassment. If my husband misunderstood me, I explained it again instead of becoming angry. If my children made mistakes, I tried to respond with curiosity before criticism. It did not work perfectly. Nothing involving children, marriage, and a kitchen ever works perfectly. One evening, my son spilled juice across the table and immediately froze. He looked terrified. I took a breath and said, "It's okay. Let's clean it up." He stared at me as if I had just announced that gravity had been cancelled. Then he smiled. I realized that small moments like that were teaching my children something important. Mistakes do not have to become disasters. A mistake can simply become the next thing we repair. That idea changed the atmosphere in our home. My husband noticed it too. We were still busy. We still had bills, schedules, work, school, and ordinary American family stress. But we were becoming less reactive. Then one afternoon, my daughter walked into the kitchen holding my notebook. She looked at me with an unusually serious expression and asked, "Mom, can I tell you something about Dad?" I immediately put down my coffee. I had no idea that her next sentence would reveal what our children had really been thinking about us. What YouTube taught me about America. My daughter looked at me and said, "Mom, Dad smiles more now." I was not prepared for that sentence. I had expected her to complain about something, ask for a snack, or tell me that her brother had done something suspicious again. Instead, she gave me a sentence that made me completely still. I looked toward the living room, where my husband was helping our son with homework. And I realized that our children had noticed a change we had barely talked about. YouTube had started as a simple tool for my English practice, but it was slowly becoming a mirror for my life. Living in the United States today means being surrounded by information. There are videos about everything: communication, parenting, work, relationships, cooking, money, pronunciation, confidence, and even how to fold a fitted sheet, which remains one of humanity's great unsolved mysteries. At first, I watched because I wanted to improve my English. I listened to slow English videos because the speakers were easier to understand. I read captions. I repeated short sentences. But eventually, I became more selective. I stopped asking, "What can I watch?" and started asking, "What can I actually use?" That question changed everything. I learned that YouTube could give me information, but it could not do the work for me. Watching a communication video did not automatically make me a better listener. I had to practice listening to my husband. Watching an English pronunciation lesson did not make me fluent. I had to open my mouth and make mistakes. Watching a relationship video did not repair our marriage. We had to have difficult conversations ourselves. That distinction became important in my life. In America, where digital learning is part of everyday life, it is easy to consume endless advice and feel productive without actually changing anything. I knew because I had done it. I could watch 10 motivational videos and still avoid one uncomfortable conversation. So I created a simple rule: every useful lesson had to become one small action. If I learned pause before responding, I practiced it. If I learned ask questions before assuming, I used it. If I learned a new English phrase, I said it aloud. Slowly, YouTube became less like entertainment and more like a personal library. But I also learned something about American life that surprised me. People around me were not necessarily living perfect lives. They were learning, adjusting, working, parenting, failing, starting again, and trying to balance independence with connection. That made me feel less alone. My family did not need a perfect system. We needed habits that helped us return to what mattered. That night, after the children went to bed, my husband and I sat together and talked about our future. He looked at me and said, "You know what changed you?" I smiled and asked, "What?" He pointed toward my laptop. "You stopped watching YouTube and started listening." I laughed. But then he said something that made me realize I had misunderstood the entire lesson from the beginning. The day I wanted to quit. The day I almost gave up, I did not look dramatic. I did not cry in the rain or throw my laptop across the room. I simply sat at my kitchen table, stared at my English notebook, and thought, maybe I am just not good at this. I had been practicing for weeks, but that morning, everything felt wrong. I mispronounced words I thought I knew. I forgot simple phrases. My husband and I had another small disagreement. The children were arguing over something completely ridiculous. My coffee was cold. Even the internet seemed to be personally offended by my existence. I wanted to quit everything for one day. English practice. YouTube. Trying to improve my communication. Trying to become a calmer wife. Trying to be the woman I kept imagining I should be. Then I remembered something I had learned from one of the slow English videos. Progress is not always visible while it is happening. That sentence stopped me. I opened my old notebook and looked at the first page. There were only a few simple phrases. I hear you. Help me understand. Let me try again. I had written them weeks earlier. They looked ordinary, but I realized something important. I was no longer the same person who had written them. I was using those phrases in real conversations. I was listening more. I was reacting less quickly. My husband and I were talking differently. My children were noticing. My English was not perfect, but I was more comfortable making mistakes. That was progress. It reminded me of how language learning actually works. You do not wake up one morning and suddenly become fluent. You build recognition, memory, pronunciation, and confidence through repeated exposure and practice. The same thing was happening emotionally. I was practicing patience. I was practicing listening. I was practicing starting over. So I made one decision that morning. I would not measure myself by how perfect I was. I would measure myself by whether I continued. I put on another English video. I listened once. Then I listened again with subtitles. Then I repeated one sentence slowly. I can try again. I smiled because the sentence was no longer just English practice. It had become my personal reminder. Later that afternoon, my husband came home and found me at the kitchen table. He asked, "Bad day?" I said, "Very bad." He smiled and sat beside me. Instead of giving advice, he simply listened. Then he said, "You know, you don't have to fix everything today." That sentence felt like someone had opened a window in a room I did not realize was suffocating me. I looked at him and laughed. Maybe YouTube should teach husbands that sentence too. We both laughed. But that evening, something happened that I never expected. My husband opened my laptop, searched for the same kind of English video I had been watching, and said, "Show me how you practice." I thought he wanted to learn English. I was wrong. He wanted to learn something else entirely. YouTube taught me more than English. My husband was not asking me to teach him English. He was asking me to teach him how to slow down. That realization still makes me emotional because, for months, I had believed YouTube was teaching me pronunciation, vocabulary, listening, and speaking. I never imagined it was quietly teaching me something much bigger, how to become present in my own life. That morning, my husband sat beside me at our kitchen table in our home in the United States. I opened the same slow English video I had watched many times before. We listened together. Then I paused the video and said, "Your turn." He repeated the sentence. We laughed at his pronunciation. Then he pointed at another phrase in my notebook. Let me try again. He looked at me and said, I think that sentence is useful for marriage too. I smiled because he was absolutely right. Our marriage had not changed because YouTube gave us a magic solution. It changed because we started practicing small behaviors repeatedly. We learned to pause before reacting. We learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. We learned that saying I hear you does not mean I agree with everything. It means I am willing to understand you. My English journey became part of that process. I still made mistakes. Sometimes I forgot words. Sometimes I needed subtitles. Sometimes I repeated one sentence so many times that even my children started laughing. But I stopped seeing mistakes as embarrassing. They became evidence that I was practicing. That mindset changed the way I approached family life too. My children saw their parents making mistakes and trying again. They saw us apologize. They saw us laugh. They saw us disagree without turning every disagreement into a disaster. And slowly, our home felt lighter. Life in America was still busy. We still had work, school, bills, schedules, chores, and those mysterious missing socks that apparently live a completely separate life. Nothing became perfect. But I became different. I stopped waiting for a perfect day to improve. I stopped believing I needed hours of study to make progress. 10 minutes of listening mattered. One sentence spoken aloud mattered. One patient conversation mattered. One apology mattered. One decision to try again mattered. Now, when someone asks me, what did YouTube teach you? I could say English. I could say pronunciation. I could say listening skills. But the honest answer is much deeper. YouTube taught me that information only becomes powerful when you use it. A video cannot repair your marriage. A lesson cannot raise your children. A phrase cannot change your life by itself. You have to take what you learn and bring it into the real world. That is what I finally did. I did not become a perfect wife, a perfect mother, or a perfect English speaker. I became a woman who was no longer afraid to begin again. And perhaps that is the real lesson. Sometimes the video you almost skip is not there to teach you everything. It is there to remind you that you can still learn.